Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.
Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. I'm your host. Today is Monday, April 7, 2025. And on this Monday, I want to share with you some ideas about recent tariff announcements, recent declines in the stock market, the prospects of a global trade war, and basically what you should expect in equity investing. Now, formerly, I worked as a licensed professional financial advisor, and it's been more than 10 years now since I held any licenses. I no longer give advice on stocks or securities. I hold no investment licenses. But in the last 10 years, even with 10 years of external perspective, I really haven't changed much of my perspective from anything that I used to say and used to believe. And I'm going to give you a basic set of bullet points here at the beginning with regard to stock market investing that I think are useful and productive and that every person who owns any kind of stocks should know. First and foremost, from my perspective, the basic job of a financial advisor is to affect his client's behavior. So I think of myself as a behavior manager. Now, that means a couple different things. Number one, it means helping the client to be optimistic about his goals, helping him to set goals that are clearly important to him, helping him to lay out a pathway that might result in his achieving those goals, and then coaching him systematically towards those goals. The ways that people win with money primarily have to do with them starting early, earning a high income, spending less than they make, and then consistently saving money year after year after year after year. And along the way, we need some good investment tools to achieve those money growth outcomes. For many of the wealthiest people, the biggest winning investments are usually involved to some degree with a business that this person begins or buys and grows, or with a career that is a very high-paying career. So one of the things that I've been arguing against for years is simply that most of the wealthiest people don't necessarily get there by saving 10% of their income into a 401k each and every year. That plan can work, and it does work, and it should be the default plan. However, when we talk about investment, we should use the term expansively and broadly, and be open to all different types of investments, and then choose the best kind of investment for an individual. Now, when people turn to stock market investing, purchasing mutual funds or perhaps individual stocks, maybe a dividend portfolio, whatever their preferred approach is to stock market investing, it's important that you know what you are getting into. Stock market investing is an amazing tool for building wealth. It is the only true way that you can build wealth passively. All you have to do is purchase shares of stock, purchase shares of a mutual fund, and sit back and wait for time to compound your returns. And if you choose, over the long term, winning investments, then you will build wealth as long as you keep on buying and you stay invested. And so the other aspect of behavior management for a financial advisor is to help a client keep on buying and stay invested. And so usually what that means is in times of euphoria, you want to keep tempering expectations and say, hey, your portfolio has doubled in the last year. Remember, this isn't normal. This probably isn't going to happen again. And then in times of great fear and uncertainty, you want to help somebody stay invested. Listen, I understand that everything is fearful. I understand that everything is collapsing. On the whole, if you just simply wait, history is probably on our side and things will probably turn out okay. It might be a rough few months. It might be a rough few years, but we want to stay invested in our high quality investments and we want to keep them. So that's my basic approach to managing client behavior. I want to help a client to see his ideal future, to chart out the best pathway towards that future, and then consistently stay invested into that plan. Stocks usually have a significant role in that plan. For some people who are very focused on, say, building a big career or building a big business, the role is usually less in the beginning, but it should not be nothing. At the very least, you should be maxing out a Roth IRA every year so that you have a startup fund. Maybe for 1 or 2 years, you have to skip your Roth IRA contributions. But on the whole, maxing out your Roth IRA is something that you absolutely should do because it gives you always that emergency fund that if your business goes bankrupt, you can start over, you can pick up, you can declare bankruptcy, you take the money from your Roth IRA, and you start afresh. And so we always want to have some money set aside, and stocks are usually the best component for that. And then even with people who run a big and successful business, the intensity or the concentration of risk in any one particular business is often simply too high. So you see right now with a prospective trade war, maybe an actual trade war, I'm not sure exactly what to say at this point, but you can see that there are some businesses that are highly exposed to this. And there are business owners who last year made money hand over fist, and this year they very well may be going into bankruptcy because they didn't predict the market conditions that they're now facing. And so that can happen to any business at any point in time. And so diversification is a really important strategy for everybody. And it's a financial advisor's job to help somebody get to the amount of proper diversification where we're highly exposed to the home run investments, but yet we're not totally exposed or overexposed to the high risk investments, but we're balancing things out carefully. The major tool that I use, we'll come back to that in a second. So the next thing is, if you're going to invest in the stock market using any form or any strategy, you need to clearly understand the numbers involved with stock market investing. I have given this speech to hundreds of people. The numbers have not changed in 2 decades much, and yet I'm amazed at how few people know this information. So first and foremost, you need to understand that the average intra-year drawdown in the stock market is about 14%. What that means is, in any particular year, in any particular calendar year, you should expect in basically every year that your stock market investments will go down by about 14%. In about half the years, it's more than 10%. Around a third of the years, it's more than 15%. And then you have other years that aren't quite as big. But what that means, you should put numbers on that. If you have $1 million portfolio, then that means in any particular year, you should expect your $1 million portfolio to decline in value by $140,000. That is the basic expectation of your portfolio. Now, in addition to that, you should understand that the average 3-year drawdown is perhaps around 20% or so, and the normal drawdown over the course of a decade is about 30%. So if the future continues to be something like the past, then about once a decade, you could expect your stock market portfolio to decline in value by 30 to even 33%, somewhere in that range. Now, these are less predictable. It hasn't happened in every term, but that should be your basic expectation. Once a decade, you're going to face a 30% decline. And during your investment lifetime, it's quite likely that there will be a 50% decline at some point during your investment lifetime. If the future is something like the past, then we can see that 50% bear market come along at least once, maybe more, during your investment lifetime. So 1973 and 1974, we had a 50% bear market, 2000 to 2002, 2008 to 2009, and who knows when the next one will be. So you want to be positioned at all times for your stock market investments to wander around from 15 to 50% in value. Now, why do we do it? Well, of course, over the long term, the stock market has been a reliable generator of wealth. It has reliably gone up when you stay invested in it for the long term, and it has consistently created huge amounts of wealth from profitable companies run by hardworking, intelligent people. So my point here is that if you see a bear market, if you see a double-digit decline in stock values, if you see a multi-double-digit decline in stock values, even a short period of time, this is what you expect from being the owner of companies. And to offset that variability of returns, you need to have confidence that the companies that you own are going to figure things out, they're going to adapt, they're going to react to market conditions, and they're going to figure out some new solutions. So over the last week, what do we see? Well, we see widespread declines in equities. The S&P 500 for last year was down something like 9%. Dow Jones Industrial Average down something like 8%. NASDAQ Composite down something like 10%. We saw big movements in cryptocurrency markets, in bond markets. We see all kinds of changes happening in the financial markets. But at the moment, all of these numbers, as far as I'm concerned, are still squarely within the expected outcomes. Now, there are many people who are smarter and more informed than I am who would be making other bets as far as, well, where are we going from here? I consider that to be broadly unknowable. I love reading smart people's commentary and love thinking about their insights. I'm just amazed by how smart they are. But when I read multiple smart people who have all kinds of different perspectives, I find it very difficult to know who's actually right. And so what I have developed is basically a personal operating system for me and for my clients that doesn't require me to make bets that are right, but rather to be positioned in to win in any particular scenario. So I call this using the tools of personal financial planning to achieve a better outcome. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, we know that if you have a high level of expenses compared to your income, and your income takes a hit and your investments take a hit, then you face the prospect of significant pain. So let's assume that you've established a lifestyle where you are spending most of what you make. Maybe you're spending 90% of what you make, saving a little bit of money, and now you're working in an industry that is severely affected by these changes in the regulatory environment, and now your boss has to reduce your salary by 20% and or potentially lay you off. Well, in that situation, you're really going to be hurting. And the conversations when you get home today are going to be extremely stressful. And that's a situation that many, many people are facing. Last week, this week, probably for the weeks ahead, many people will have very difficult conversations. We need to pull the children out of the schools that they're in. We need to cancel the club memberships. We need to make significant changes in our lifestyle because we have created a lifestyle that depends on a high income. So what I have suggested is, whenever possible, try to build a lifestyle that you can cover the basics on a rather small portion of your income. Now, this is really difficult. If you're earning $50,000 a year and you have 5 children, and your total household income is $50,000 a year, I'm not expecting you to be able to live on $20,000 a year. But if you're earning $350,000 a year and you have 5 children, if you set your baseline budget on $200,000 a year, and then you just do the luxuries on an ad hoc basis on top of that, then you'll be very well positioned. And so what are the tools that we use for that? Well, the most important tool is minimizing payments. What are payments? A payment, and here I mean a debt payment, is a promise to do something in the future that you make now or in the past. And so if I borrow money from you and I say, listen, I need $10,000 and I borrow money from you, then that means that that I have now promised a certain percentage of my work income and my work and my plans in the future to pay you back the $10,000. So I've committed my future to a certain pathway in advance, and I don't know whether I will be able to complete that pathway or not. So I think that in the vast majority of cases, most people are very well served by scrupulously avoiding debt. And when you have no payments to anybody for any reason, then you can take a 50% collapse in your income. You can take a layoff, and you can be personally resilient in those circumstances. Now, what are the exceptions to that? When does debt make a whole lot of sense? Well, I think debt makes more sense when there is an asset tied to it that specifically can be sold to cover the debt. So the obvious solution here is if you are going to purchase a house for $500,000 and you need to take out a $250,000 mortgage to allow you to purchase that house, well, I'm not saying don't do that. I think that would be a perfectly fine and reasonable financial move. But if you take out the mortgage of $400,000 and you have an $1,100 payment on one car and you have a $1,200 payment on another car and you have student loans left over and you have the children in $40,000 a year private schools and, then all of a sudden the whole house can fall apart. So if you're very prudent and very cautious, and let's say that your rules are something like, well, I only borrow money for purchasing a house to live in, or I am only borrowing money to start this business, and I have that segregated in some way, then you are better able to react to market conditions. It's not like everybody with an $1,100 car payment is going to go under if there's a trade war and all of a sudden your company faces tough times. There are tons of people who have an $1,100 a month car payment and will have no trouble because they make $600,000 a year and they've just chosen to lease this car for $1,100 a month. That's no problem. But it's when you're living close to the edge and you have stacks and stacks of payments, that's where things really start to hurt. And that's where a minor temporary decline in the stock market can feel like the entire world is collapsing on top of you because your income is affected, your payments are going up, interest rates are going up, everything is collapsing around you. Whereas if you will be more conservative with your personal finances, then you can weather your way through the storm, and then your family can come out on the other side with most of your lifestyle intact. So I don't think that most people can accomplish something like, I'm going to lose my job of 100% of my income for 10 years and, not declare bankruptcy. That's probably not reasonable. But in general, I would say a good plan would be to say, I'm going to lose 50% of my income for 3 or 4 years while there's a big recession on, and I have to kind of scrounge around for a little bit. Could I keep my lifestyle going? I wouldn't be able to save money, but could I keep my lifestyle going without a big disruption to my family circumstances? So that kind of conservatism with regard to finances works out really well. Now, people who live that way often don't actually need that kind of conservatism because when you're saving 20, 30, 50% of your income, what happens is your savings can quickly account for other expenses. And so your whole need for a big emergency fund and everything like that goes down because your wealth increases. So the big behavior management and modification plan is to make certain that you spend a substantially lower amount of what you make. That is the winning strategy. And if you want to spend a lot more, just focus on making more. And in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, you can get there. And when that happens, you will sit back and be fairly well insulated from panic and disaster when it happens in the financial markets. Now, what else can you do? Well, I think you can continue to engage in good personal financial planning with regard to other aspects of your expenses. So having an emergency fund is a very valuable step to make certain that if you lose your job or you face a 50% decline in your income because of a bad market condition, then you're okay because you have savings to see you through. And the goal here is basically to give you time to maneuver. So if you have a 6-month emergency fund and you still have some income, well, you can maneuver that 6-month emergency fund into perhaps a year or 18 months of expenses without having to make drastic changes. And in many financially, I don't want to say catastrophic here, but financially disruptive periods, just having a year or 2 years of runway will really make a big difference. And so I like to think of money as kind of the first step of it, but I think there's all kinds of other frugal tools that also come into play. So you might eat filet mignon every single day, multiple times per day, because that's what you really like. But if you needed to, you could switch to eating pork chops. And if you really needed to, then you could bring in rice and beans a couple times a week. So basically being able to react and adapt to circumstances around is really key. Then with regard to your investments, we want to make certain that since you know the expected volatility of something like the stock market, you only have enough money exposed to the stock market as you're comfortable experiencing that volatility. So we don't want to have everything in stocks. We want to have money diversified. And so for an average and normal family, if you own a home, then of course your home values might be affected by what's happening, but it provides you with some stability. You might have a rental house or a couple rental houses. You might have some kind of real estate investment fund that you participate in. You might have 5% of your portfolio in gold coins. You might keep some cash. You might have a bond allocation. You might have some Bitcoin. You might have other assets. So you're not entirely focused on the market conditions, and you also have your earning ability. So people who go through this kind of careful, thoughtful planning process, really with kind of a relatively normal market drawdown, even a bear market, should be well insulated emotionally to not worry too much about it, to let the drama of the day play out and wake up in a month or a quarter or a year and see where we are. So politicians and Federal Reserve employees and everyone who's involved in that space tend to have a desire and a need to do what is in the best interest of the people. That's how they retain their power and authority. That's what they are elected or hired to do. And so they are the ones with the responsibility to do their best to, to keep things going forward. And in the fullness of time, they tend to respond to market conditions. And usually we seem to have avoided the worst case scenarios. Now, could the worst case scenario happen? Could we all be, living for fear in a remote cabin with the entire collapse of the financial system? Yes, we could. I fully embrace that as a possibility. I think it is less likely than a lot of people believe it, but I embrace that as a possibility. So for that, we do good financial preparedness, good conservative financial planning, and then we supplement that with what I think of as just good prepping, good physical preparedness. Because if the financial markets totally broke down and we faced widespread famine in the land, then you want to make sure that you are protected from that. And so everybody, right, who should have at least several months of food storage, if you go down to Costco and just purchase a year's worth of freeze-dried food for your family for $8,000 or $10,000, you can tuck it aside in the basement, and it'll probably be good for the next couple of decades, and that way you sleep a little better at night. And so you can get into prepping, and you should, with a modest amount of your focus and resources, because if there is a hardcore collapse of society, then you want to make sure that you are well prepared for that. And then the final piece of this is that if you face in your country, you face a catastrophic collapse, a hyperinflating currency, a social collapse leading to violence in the streets, as has happened all around the world over the last couple of decades, then my basic plan for that is that you should have an escape plan. That's why I have a course at internationalescapeplan.com. And the idea is if things get so bad in your home country that you have to leave, then you pluck up and you go to a backup location, and hopefully you sit in that backup location until the fires burn out in your home country. And as I have studied collapse after collapse after collapse all around the world, they all go through this same basic process. You have a series of bad policies, usually something akin to socialism or communism, that ultimately leads to a collapse of the market order. A well-regulated market order leads to increasing levels of violence, leads to a lot of currency risk. This has tended to often be accompanied by significant inflation, even hyperinflation in times, but sometimes it's a deflation. And you get this kind of cycle where it gets worse and worse and worse. Violence increases, hyperinflation increases, and then finally, whoever happens to be in power is basically forced to make some kind of changes. So comes in with some sweeping austerity measure, comes in with a very high power military to stop the violence in the streets, imposes martial law. This brings back stability to the marketplace. And usually it doesn't seem like this kind of hyperinflation really can last for more than 2 years or so. So I think if you have something like a 3 or 4 year runway to move abroad, then I think you're pretty good. And so, if I have wealthier clients who are trying to buy some insurance, I'll say, why don't you put 1 to 2 years worth of expenses in an offshore bank account in a different currency? That way, if your home currency starts to collapse, at least you could move abroad and you could live there for a couple of years while you sell some other investments or have some other kind of plan in place but at least your family is safe. You're not in the eye of the storm, so to speak. Or I guess I should say you're not in the eye wall of the storm, because the eye is the safe part. The eye wall is the most intense part. So that's how I think about financial planning. And as I've done this for years, and I've laid that out there in about 25 minutes, I haven't found a financial problem that can't be fixed with an application of those techniques. Now, there's a whole lot of individual aspects that I've not addressed. So, for example, if you are a trader, or you want to be a trader and you want to speculate on the direction of the market, well, I'm not addressing that. If you have some insight and want to make a big bet on the future of a trade war or the non-future of a trade war, I'm not addressing that. What I'm saying is, if you have a clear understanding of what the norm is, then this should not surprise you, because so far, this is totally normal. And I'm astonished. I run into a lot of people who say, I never invest in stocks. Then I don't think you have to invest in stocks to build well. But they'll say, well, the market's down 15%. And I say, yeah, so what? That's totally normal. And they just don't have a clear understanding of what the expected norm is. So I've addressed most people who are in an accumulation phase. Who have I not addressed? Well, I've not addressed people who are in a wealth using phase, who are in a deaccumulation phase, who are in a spending phase. And these are the people who tend to get most consistently hurt by a down market. So we have a set of rules for this. Financial planners have worked hard on this to try to find good solutions for people. Because let's say someone who is retiring, if you're planning to retire this year, or let's say 3 months ago you retired, then this runs and puts you in a substantial risk of breaking your retirement plan. If you're at the edge of your retirement plan and you retire into a market, and what I mean by at the edge is if you are kind of trying to maximize the amount of money that you can take out of your retirement investments. You're not retiring and spending 2% of your portfolio every year. You're retiring and spending 5% of your portfolio every year. Well, if you're in that situation, then a bad stock market that you retire into is your single biggest risk. It's called, in retirement planning, the sequence of returns risk. Is if you retire into a bad set of market conditions in the first years of retirement, it allows you to have a much worse retirement outcome than if you retire into a good set of market conditions during your first years of retirement. And so how do we solve this? Well, we have a whole set of techniques to try to resolve this. And I have a whole retirement course that I have taught on this, and there's lots of good advice that people can have. And in essence, at its core, anybody who has flexibility, meaning, okay, I'm not trying to maximize what I'm withdrawing from my retirement portfolio. I'm willing to take a phased approach to retirement. I'm willing to set aside some cash. It's not just all or once and done. Or somebody who's flexible with expenses. All right, I'd like to spend $10,000 a month, but if I had to spend $6,000 a month, that would be fine. Anybody with flexibility in expenses, or flexibility in working versus not working, or flexibility in lifestyle choices is well served by good financial planning techniques that protect you from this risk. And there's a whole set of rules that we have in the financial industry, and we have them for a reason. So you've heard people say, well, if you have an investment goal that's coming within the next 5 years, that money should not be invested. And what I remind you is that rule of thumb exists for a reason. And nobody wants to do it. Nobody, when their child turns 13 years old, wants to actually open up a 529 account and put a portion of it into cash. But those who don't do it may wind up facing a substantial risk. So the markets are broadly unpredictable. And so we use these tools and rules of thumb to try to protect you from that. So markets are good. Take your profits. Take some money off the table. Don't be greedy. You don't want to be greedy. You have enough, and let's develop flexibility. So retirees face challenges, but a good retirement plan and a well-orchestrated kind of approach should include a lot of flexibility. And when I do retirement planning for people, we go through that in detail. And so I would encourage you, any good, competent financial planner can walk you through that. All of us know what those risks are. We've got a good set of tools to fix those risks. And basically, in most circumstances, if you have some flexibility for a couple of years, then generally speaking, that's enough to get you through most bad markets. And we can expect that probably, if the future is anything like the past, within a couple years, things will wind up better. So my point so far is to say that you can take control of your circumstances with good planning. You don't have to predict trade wars. You don't have to predict tariffs. You don't have to predict the economy. You can take control with good planning. Now let's talk for a moment about tariffs and about trade wars, and I'll share my opinions and perspectives on them. First, I don't generally bother having opinions about things I either don't know a lot about or can't affect. All of my academic and professional training has taught me that tariffs are bad. In essence, I'm broadly, by training and experience, I'm broadly a free trade absolutist, that the world should just be free and open, and that tariffs are a losing strategy. So if I were elected Emperor of the United States or elected President of the United States, I don't see how I would be pursuing the strategy that President Trump is pursuing with his tariff strategy. And as best I can tell, the educated elite broadly agrees with that anti-tariff strategy. The problem is that I think those of us in the educated elite are often a bit blind to the difficulties that many Americans are living through. I did not realize this until President Trump was reelected the second time. But after his reelection, I thought to myself, what feels so different now versus before? And a lot of it came in with all the rhetoric about Canada, the 51st state, and all this stuff. And I realized, this is the first time in my lifetime that a president has been trying to improve things. And I went back and I thought about all the presidents that I have lived under. I remember the election of President Clinton, not of George Herbert Walker Bush before him, but President Clinton, and then all along since. And I realized that every president in my lifetime, even though I voted for various of them and I had high hopes, none of them actually had any kind of expansionist or improvement rhetoric. In my entire lifetime, politicians have basically been managing the decline. And so in my entire lifetime, never have I lived under a president who seemed intent on not simply managing the decline, not simply basically doing very little and arguing that, well, it's all going to be fine at the edges. Now, whether or not that is true is, I think, an interesting abstract argument to have. Did they actually just manage the decline, or is that just a sense? Well, the problem with that is perception is reality. And so, even though I love wonky stats people who can sit around and say, well, look, things are so much better off now than they were before, the average man doesn't respond to wonky stats people, but to rhetoric and to an inspiring vision. And so, for the first time in my life, I find myself under a president who seems expansionist, who seems to want to set big goals, who seems to want to change things. And I think for a lot of Americans, that is a really important component. And how do you do it? Well, I'm opposed to tariffs and trade wars and all of that. I'm a free trade guy in terms of all of my training and education. But I also recognize that the United States is in a massive state of decline, and something has to happen to change that. So while I wouldn't impose tariffs, I'm fascinated to sit back and watch and see what happens, because it could be that I'm wrong and that President Trump is right. On this particular issue, I will give him the respect that he deserves, that this has been his issue going back to the 1980s. I stumbled across a full-page ad that I think he took out in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal back in the 80s, where he wrote this big letter about the need for the United States to impose tariffs on countries that were taking advantage of it. So he's been consistent on this issue for 40 years. Now, is he right about this issue, or is he just simply consistent on it? I don't know. But I can't do anything except vote. I can't do anything except try to adapt my own personal business interest to whatever the current environment is. And so I'm going to sit back and I'm going to watch. And at the end of the day, the markets and the voting populace will decide who wins and who loses. But I find this to be a fascinating circumstance. Regardless of how this works out, I do think we can expect just constant and never-ending volatility for the rest of the 2020s. Now, I say that because I've been significantly influenced by George Friedman's book called The Storm Before the Calm, as well as a number of other geopolitics books that I have read. And George Friedman's book is something of a cyclical analysis of history type book, kind of like The Fourth Turning, in the sense that you have these cyclical changes in society. And what he argues is that every so often, the United States has had to completely reinvent its political system and its economic system in order to stay current. And both of those trends, in terms of the cyclical number of years, are hitting on the 2020s. And so he argues in that book that the 2020s will be a period of substantial unrest, of substantial shaking up, lots of big changes, because the country is inventing a totally new political system and a totally new economic system. But then after the United States invents those new systems and adapts to them, then once again, there will be a period of prosperity and growth. And I can see that truth in the political system. The political system of today reflects nothing of the political system of my youth. The values maintained, the arguments made, the only thing we have is basically the names Republicans and Democrats in the United States. But the actual on-the-ground politics reflect very little about the political system of my youth. And so we see a brand new political system being invented. And I think also what we see is kind of the starting points of a brand new economic system also being invented. So will it be good? Will it be bad? I don't know. I can't affect it. It's not what I would do, but I have recognized that I would not make a very good president. And so for my many complaints about President Trump, he seems to be uniquely suited with his ability and willingness to be the wrecking ball to a system that is not working and has not worked for a huge variety of Americans. And I respect him for that, even though I think he's probably wrong, but I don't have to judge, so I'll wait and see. I think he's probably wrong, but I respect him for that. And the United States does really well on chaos because we're a largely ungovernable people who respond really well to kind of chaos and slip in and work and develop new things and new opportunities for ourselves. And so on the whole, I'm relatively optimistic. And thus far, I'm not ready to say the sky is falling. I'm not heading for the hills. I think we're well in the range of normal. Now, when we get to more than a 50% decline in the stock market, then I'm going to revisit all of my assumptions. I probably won't be where I am. I'll probably be on some other corner of the world. I don't know. But at the moment, I would say that if you've followed good financial planning tools and you've established your life, you should be well insulated from market variations. And I've been preaching this message publicly for more than 10 years, and I have yet to see any flaw in what I have said. And just kind of the last point, 80% of your focus should be on just conventional good financial planning like I've described. I would say 10% of your focus, so 80% on good conventional financial planning, just not living near the margin. 20% should be on basically worst case disaster planning. And of that 20%, we should split it 10% into, prepping at home so that if there's a hyperinflation or some kind of mass rioting in the streets, or a pandemic or something like that, then you're well prepared to stay at home for a few months and kind of weather through in comfort. And then 10% should be in terms of international prepping, so that if your currency collapses or your home country collapses, then you should be positioned to pick up and go to a backup location where you have established a backup location. So you should pick up and move to your secondary location. Hopefully you have documents there, you have a residence permit, hopefully you have a house there or some ability to do that, and that will get you through even the worst case collapses. So those are my thoughts. A bit of a reprise. I don't like doing shows like this because I constantly repeating stuff I've said for 10 years, but I know that it's useful for new listeners who are looking for kind of a simple, concentrated output where it's all here. And so that's what this is. Thank you for listening. I'll be back with you very soon.